Hi, it's Luke here and welcome in the second tutorial about astronomy. Today we'll talk more about fields definition. So let's start from the example from the previous tutorial where we defined the user class. We've already told that we can define field type by providing directly type constructor next to the field name, or just by passing object with the type property and constructor of the type. And there are several different types you can use right away, and you can find all of them in the documentation. It is string, number, boolean, date, object, and Mongo object ID. So you can provide here any predefined type, or you can create your own type just by creating classes or enums or unions, but we'll talk about this later. The second very important thing is default value of the field. To provide default value for the field, you have to use default property. And as a value, you provide, let's say, John. And let's see how it will work. Var new user, and let's see what we have here. As you can see right now, when creating a new user, Astronomy used default value for the first name field. If you don't provide default value for the field, like in last name field in this example, you can see that default value is undefined. So it's not null. You have to provide null by yourself if you want to use it. There is one important thing to note here, that when you have type that is not plain JavaScript type, but it is, for example, object, then you can just provide it as a value of the default property. You have to provide function that will return value. So let's add the address field here, which will be of the object type. So it can have like street name or number or postcode, and you would like to provide default value for this field. And we can just provide here an object with street, because this object would be shared between all the instances of the user object. So instead, we have to provide function which will return new instance of this object. So every time new user object is created, it will invoke this function and return new instance of this object. So let's see if it's gonna work. Let's create new user and check what we have here. As you can see, we have address field which has some street, and when we create new object of the same class, you can see that we have also the address field with the default value, but by returning object from the function, we created two different instances of this address object. So when I change address street to some value, it won't affect address street in the second object. It's still the default value. There is one more thing worth noting here. It is global default setting. By default, when you create new instance of the class, it will set all default values in an instance of the object. So it's not what you may want to do in all cases. Let's say you have some object, some document stored in a collection, and let's say the address field is empty for this instance. And when fetching this document from collection, it will set default value for whatever you set. So even if you have empty field in a database, it will be filled with default value. So you may want to change that. And for that, we can set default property in the global settings. We can find information about it here in documentation. As you can see, we have to import Astro and set defaults to false. And now, after reload, when we create new user object, you will see that default value was not set. Okay, so you may ask, what's the point of turning off default values when you can't use it right now? But actually you can. You can override this setting for particular document creation. So let's create a new user document, and as the second argument we'll pass options and we'll set defaults to true. And right now it set all the default values. So you can right now decide for which operation you want to use default values, and you are in the control. The next thing we'll talk about is optional fields. Right now every field is required, so if you don't provide value for the field, it will raise exception on save operation. So let's try to create a new user object and save it. As you can see, we have validation error, first name is required. So we can change that by setting optional property to true. Now let's try one more time. New user, save. And right now you can see that the last name field is required. So when we set the last name field as optional, we will be able to save document. And document had been saved. Okay, let's move on. Now we'll talk about nested fields. As MongoDB is document-oriented database, we can not only store plain JavaScript types, but also objects. As we showed in the example before, we could store address object, but we can store also instances of classes. So let's create new address class that will have name address. It won't have any collection property because we'll store it as a nested field of the user class. And let's define some fields like city, which will be string, and street, which also will be string. And right now we can use this type as any different type. So address field, type, and address. That way you can nest as many classes as you want. So address field can have nested fields, which we would define here. So let's see an example. Now we will create new user object. And you can see that address is undefined, but we provide address, which will be city, street, some street. And right now, when you check, you can see that address field is not just a plain object that was passed as the first argument to the user class constructor. It's actually an instance of the address class. So we could define some helpers in the address class and use it like user address that and the helper name. So it's very handy because Astronomy just casts plain objects on construction to instances of classes of the field. Okay, until now we only talked about types which store single value, but we can also store multiple values. So let's first move address class to the different file to not pollute our code. And now we'll import address from the same directory but address file, and we will use it as before. Let's check if everything works properly. Yeah, it should. Okay, one more check. Yes, it works as before. Okay, so multiple values in one field. Let's say we have phones field, where we would like to store not only one phone, but several phone numbers. So we can do it by providing array and the type of the field in it. Let's say it will be string. So right now we can store multiple strings in the phones field. We could also create phone class and store multiple phones object. So right now we'll just use string. And let's see how it's gonna work. Okay, right now we have empty phones field, but we can provide argument phones and provide some phone numbers here. And it will be stored properly. But of course, right now we have some required fields. And here's a very important thing. If you want to push new phones to the phones array, you probably want to set default value for this field. So we'll provide default function because we are not returning plain value like string number, but returning object which is array. So we'll just return empty array. Thanks to that, on new document creation, it will fill phones field with the empty array. But of course, we need to provide defaults true option because we turned it off in the global setting. And right now we have fonts array, and we can add new font by pushing new string into array. And it works. The next nice feature of the Astronomy are transient fields. Transient field is a field that is not stored in a database, so it's only for just some operation you want to execute. Let's say that we have birth date field, and it will be of the date type, and we want to have not only birth date but the age of actual user. So for that we can provide age field, but we don't want to store age in a database. We only want to calculate it when document is fetched from the database. So let's set type to number and mark it as transient true. So right now this field won't be saved to database. So right now we'll just fetch our user object, which is this one, and we will set the birth date Let's save it. Oops. We've changed type of the. Let's make it as in original example. We'll make it optional for now, so we can work with this. Okay, one more try. Let's fetch document, set birth date, and save. Okay, fonts number is required. So let's set fonts to empty array and save it one more time. Okay, document is saved. Okay, right now when we fetch this document, we can see that we have the age field. It's undefined, but it's not stored in a database. To show it, let's go to the console and Meteor shell to enter server console, and user class is not available, so we have to enter Yagi Astronomy Astro class classes user. It's kind of hack, but it just works. Yes, okay, so we'll just assign it to user, and we can right now get collection users, and we can find one on this. And as you can see, it just returned pure JavaScript object that is stored in database. And we have first name, last name, fonts, birth date, but there is no age field. So it's the proof that this field wasn't stored. So how actually we can populate this field with some value that is calculated on document fetch? For that, we can use events. We'll talk about events more in the future tutorials, but right now I will just provide an example of the after init event, which is executed just after document instantiation. So I will just insert here some code that I've prepared before. I will explain it briefly. In the event object, I have current target, which is a document on which we execute event. So we take this document and later we just calculate age using the birth date. If birth date is available, then we just make diff date now minus birth date at time, and we set age field in this document to I hope it will work. Some mistake. Oh, sorry, it's not a function, it's just a property. Okay, and let's fetch a document. And as you can see, right now age had been calculated properly using birth date. The next thing are immutable fields. Immutable fields are fields that you can't modify after inserting into the database. So let's mark this field as immutable. Okay, let's fetch a document and try setting birth date to the current date and save it. As you can see, save operation returns 0, so 0 documents were modified. That means that when we fetch a document one more time, it will still have the previous value. So we can't modify this field anymore. We can only set it on construction and saving it for the first time. Okay, one more thing worth noting here. Why we have actually types system? And the reason for that is validation and casting. Casting allows you to cast values coming, let's say, from the forms to values that you want to store in your classes. So let's say we have some input field to provide phone numbers, and you want to store these phone numbers as numbers and not strings. But input fields in HTML store strings, so we can pass these strings to numbers automatically. So let's see an example of that. So let's create a new user and provide phones, and we'll set it to some string. And let's see what we have here. As you can see, it stored string, and by default Astronomy is not casting values because it's quite heavy operation, and we can provide options argument as the last argument of the constructor, and we can set cast to true. Right now it will cast phones to proper values. As you can see right now, it's number and not string. We can also cast values not only on document construction, but also using the set method that we'll talk more about in future tutorials. And right now we can just see that we can use the set method, and as the first argument provide field name, let's say first name, and as a value we'll provide number, and the first name field expects string. So right now it will be number. But when we provide the last argument, which is options, and set cast to true, the first name will be string. So number was casted to string. Okay, let's talk about enum types. Enum types are enumerated types that you can read more about in documentation, but for now you have to know that it allows to define type which can have multiple different values, but you can store only one of these values in a field. So let's copy this example. We have to import enum from Astronomy, and we'll change available values to active and inactive. So it will allow to mark user as active or inactive. Let's add new field, which will be of the status type. And we'll also, if Meteor is client, export this status window status. So we can access it from the console and it should work. So let's check out status. Yes, it works. And as you can see, we have status active, status inactive properties. And they just received numbers 0 and 1. Right now we can fetch user and status is undefined, so we can use status active to set it and save it. Now you can see that status is stored and it's 0, which stands for active. So of course you can set different status in this document, but what if you want to get identifier for a given value? So we know that active is 0, inactive is 1, but when you have more identifiers, it may be hard to tell which one is which. So we have here method status, which can get identifier for a given value. For 0, it's active, for 1, it's inactive. So if you want to get identifier having value of a field, then you can use this method. There is also get identifiers method that will just return all the identifiers so we can use it in some calculations. Okay, until now we used number values for our identifiers, but we can use also any different value. So we can provide here object instead of an array, and as keys we have our identifiers, and as values we can use Boolean values or strings. And let's see how it works. And of course there are two different types, it's Boolean and string, but marking a field as of the status type, which will allow both values. Okay, let's talk right now about unions. Union is a type that allows you to store many different type of values in a field. Let's say you have some field that can be string or number. Let's say it's called phone number. Right now, you can only provide string constructor or number constructor, which doesn't solve your problem because you want to store both. So for that, we can use unions. So let's go to the documentation and see how we can define unions. As you can see, we have to import union from the Astronomy, and we create union by providing name and allowed types. So let's copy this. We import union, and we have string or number type and string or number name. And we can store string or number. So let's use this type and see how it works. We'll fetch our document and phone number can be string. Let's save it. It allowed. Let's now store a number and save it one more time. It's allowed. And let's store right now date. And we have error. Phone number has to be a string. Of course, it returns the first validation error. String is the first type that you provided, so it will just throw error for the first type that it's not correct. When talking about unions, we have one big problem. We can't cast values automatically, because how Astronomy can know which type would you like to cast to? Of course, it could cast to string, which is the first value, first type, but we use different approach. You have to provide cast function, and as the first argument, you receive value, and you have to return new value that will be casted. So you have to make here some calculation, some checking, and decide what type do you want to cast to, if it has to be string or number. So let's say we'll just cast it to string all the time. Okay, so let's fetch our document and try setting phone number to number and using cast option. And as we set cast function to return always string, it should be string right now, and it is. Okay, that's it for now. We'll talk more about more features of Astronomy in future videos. If you like it, give it a thumb up and subscribe to my channel to be notified about new tutorials, and see you soon.